Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta, and thank you for joining me today on my show called Consistent Preterism. Today I am going to be speaking a little bit about Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10. And I'm going to try to connect that to a few places that I've been touching upon lately in my audios. You guys who have followed me know that I've been talking a lot about Revelation 14 and Revelation 7 specifically, where we can come to the very, very clear and obvious conclusion that the great multitude from all nations that was singing the salvation song was the same people as the 144,000 of the 12 tribes of Israel that was also singing the redemption song in Revelation 14. And Revelation 14 says that only the 12 tribes could learn that redemption song. So naturally, if only the 12 tribes could learn that redemption song, then the great multitude from all nations, tongues, peoples, and kindreds in Revelation 7, who is singing that same redemption song, is the 12 tribes. Okay, and there's much more that can be said on that, much more connections, many more connections, I should say, and it's just really, really undeniable. I have not heard anyone reject or refute that argument whatsoever. There's just no chance. And I have another, I've put out a bunch of material on that if you wanted to go back and listen. I also have another short teaching that I'm going to hopefully share this week about that again, because I came across some more ties and some more constituent elements in the two groups that really nail it down even further. Not that it needed to be nailed down further, but it just hammers it home even more. But I want you to remember that great multitude from all nations is the 12 tribes of Israel when we're looking at Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10. So we know from Acts 10 that God gives Peter a vision of all sorts of unclean animals, right? And clearly these animals represent different types of people groups, all right? Different people from different nations, unclean people, right? Uncommon. And at the end of the chapter, we see that the Holy Spirit falls upon Cornelius and his family. And then if we jump over to Acts chapter 11, the very next chapter, in verse 4 forward, we read this. It says, "But Peter explained it to them in order from the beginning, saying, I was in the city of Joppa praying, and in a trance I saw a vision, an object descending like a great sheet, let down from heaven by four corners. And it came to me. When I observed it intently and considered, I saw four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And I heard a voice saying, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But I said, Not so, Lord, for nothing common or unclean has at any time entered my mouth. But the voice answered me again from heaven, and said, What God has cleansed you must not call common. Now this was done 3 times, and all were drawn up again into heaven." So what is God telling Peter here in this vision? Well, he's telling him that many people from many different nations would be cleansed, right? Forgiven, made white, washed, made clean from their former unclean status. Okay? Now, if we think about that and we try to connect that to places in the New Testament, we can do so very easily. This idea matches what Paul told the Ephesians, for example, that Christ had nailed their trespasses of the law to the cross. Well, now, obviously, we know that only the Israelites had the law. So why would pagans be being told that Christ has nailed their trespasses of the law that only Israel had to the cross? It just doesn't make any sense. We see this in places like Colossians, where the Colossians are being told that Christ has, quote, abolished the handwritten requirements that were against them. Why would pagan Colossians have the handwritten requirements of the law of Moses being held over their heads and against them? It just makes no sense. But this whole theme is repeated by Paul throughout all the letters in the New Testament. And obviously, if we know that the great multitude from all nations in Revelation 7 is the 12 tribes of Israel, then we know that all the letters and the epistles that were written to those places in the New Testament were being written to Israelites. That goes without saying. It's just common sense, and there's no way around that. So the point here is that Paul is repeatedly telling these Israelites that they've been cleansed, they've been forgiven, they've been washed by the blood. Now, if we go over to Revelation 14, as I mentioned earlier, we see that the 144,000 of the 12 tribes are the only ones who could learn the redemption song. The only ones, folks. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that when it says that they're the only ones who could learn the redemption song, it necessitates that they were the only ones redeemed. Right? I mean, there's no way to spin that. As badly as people want to try, you just cannot do it. So these were the only ones who could learn the redemption song because they were the only ones redeemed, and they're the 12 tribes of Israel. We read in Revelation 14 that these are virgins and undefiled. Again, symbolizing their being cleansed and purified. Okay? Then, if we keep that in mind and we jump back to Revelation 7, verse 9 and forward, and read about the great multitude from all the nations, we need to take note of where they came from, okay, and what John says about them. He says, these are the ones who come out from the great tribulation. That's the last day's great tribulation period, the only great tribulation period in this entire story. The great multitude from all nations came out from that period, which means that this great multitude from all nations has absolutely nothing to do with anybody beyond that. All right, but notice what else it says. It says, and they, the great multitude from all nations, have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. All right, so again, there's that washing and cleansing that Peter had this vision about. Right, what God has cleansed, do not call unclean. Okay, so these ones from the nations that Peter had the vision about are the same ones in Revelation 7, the great multitude from all nations, who were cleansed and made white. That's exactly what God told Peter. What I have cleansed, do not call common. He has washed them with the blood of the Lamb, right? As we continue, we see this, and this is embodying the perfect picture of the prodigal son, isn't it? The prodigal son was out in the nations, out in the pagan nations, rolling around in filth, living unclean and filthy. But then he comes back and God accepts him and has mercy upon him. This is a perfect picture of the Israelites out in the nations. Then if we jump over to Revelation 7, 1-8, we see who got the Holy Spirit. It says only the 12 tribes received the Holy Spirit. Well, if we think about Cornelius got that Holy Spirit, didn't he? Of course he did. All right, the point here is that the vision that God gave to Peter about all the unclean animals, which represent people, being cleansed by God, fits in perfectly with the final picture of the 12 tribes of Israel being called out from all the nations where they were, being washed, cleansed, and made white. They enter into their final inheritance, the new city that only had the 12 tribes' names written on it. And take note of what Revelation 21 says about that city. It says, but there shall by no means enter anything unclean. By no means enter anything unclean. When you understand that this statement actually embodies Israel only, all the way, kind of shocks you, doesn't it? Once all Israel was saved and cleansed and washed, never again would anything unclean enter into their new city. It's crazy to think about it that way, but the city was only for them, so it makes perfect sense. So again, a very brief one today. Not a lot, don't want to go too deep into it. I've made a lot of very extensive videos in the past where if you want more, if you want to learn about why the letters written to these churches were actually all written to Israelites, I have a 6-part series on that detailing each of 6 different Gentile churches: Philippians, Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Colossians. It's all there. All right. And of course, we know again, if the great multitude from all nations was indeed the 12 tribes of Israel, which I've proved that up, down, left, right, then the vision that Peter received of the beasts and and the animals, the unclean animals being cleansed and being washed, pertained only to Israelites. Because that's who the great multitude was. They were out in all the nations, scattered, dispersed, paganized, fulfilling what Moses predicted back in Deuteronomy 4:27 and forward. Like James wrote to them, he wrote to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, greetings, my brethren. That entire letter of James is written only to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. Not the 12 tribes in Judea, not the 12 tribes in Judea and Samaria, the 12 tribes scattered abroad, meaning everywhere. Peter wrote his epistles to the elect of the dispersion out in the nations. Not the dispersed ones in Judea, not the dispersed ones in Judea and Samaria, but the dispersed ones out in the nations. He's writing to Israelites. Paul, when he wrote to the Corinthians, explained to them that all of their fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. Okay, not as Big Billy Bell would have you think that there was a mixed multitude with the Israelites when they passed through the Red Sea. So that's what Paul is talking about when he's writing to Gentiles. I mean, can you believe it? That's his definition or his way of explaining that passage away. That there was a mixed multitude of people that came through the Red Sea with the body of Old Covenant Israelites. And that's what Paul was referring to, because of course he has to have Paul writing to pagans in the book of Corinth, right? In the book of the Corinthians. But that's just false. Okay? Like Paul said in Romans 4 verse 1, what did our father Abraham find according to the law? Do you know how many times the term Abraham's seed is used in the Old Testament? And not even once is that term ever used to speak of anyone other than the Israelites. Moses, in Deuteronomy 1, verses 9 and 10, when speaking to the Israelites, refers back to the promise that God made to Abraham about his seed, that God said to Abraham he would multiply his seed like the stars of heaven in number. Okay, now Christians mistakenly think that that's speaking about them today. They look around, they say, hey, there's Christians everywhere in America, in Africa, in Australia. We're all over the place, right? So we're the ones who are going to be multiplied like the stars of heaven in number. Well, not so. That promise was fulfilled centuries ago in Old Covenant Israel. Just go read Deuteronomy 1 verses 9 and 10, and Moses applies that promise that was made to Abraham about his descendants, his seed, becoming as the stars of heaven in number, and he speaks to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 1 verses 9 and 10, and he flat out tells them, Israel, you've become like the stars of heaven in number and are too much for me to bear. Or go read David, I think it's 1 Chronicles chapter 27, when he's counting the Israelites for war, and it says that he did not count the Israelites who were 20 years of age and younger, because the Lord had promised to multiply Israel like the stars of heaven in number. That's exactly what God promised Abraham about his seed. So Abraham's seed, that term in this story, is always, always, always about Israel. So when you come to places like Galatians 3, and you see Paul say to them, hey, look, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew, if you're a Greek, if you're a Roman, if you're a slave, if you're free. It doesn't matter. If you're Christ's, it's because you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise. In other words, if you're Christ's, it's because you're an Israelite and an heir according to the promise. See, there were Israelites all over. There were Israelites in Judea. There were Israelites in Samaria. There were Israelites in Rome. There were Israelites in Corinth. Israelites were Greeks. Israelites were Romans. They were everywhere. And Paul was seeking and saving that which was lost. That was the mission. When Jesus told them, go not in any city of the Samaritans and don't go to the way of the Gentiles, but rather go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's Matthew 10, right? And then we see him in Acts chapter 1 totally contradict that and say, go preach the gospel to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the land. Well, sorry, hate to break it to you, but Jesus wasn't confused. Jesus was not contradicting himself. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus tells him, don't go to any of these places, but rather go to the lost sheep. Okay, he tells them, don't go to the Samaritans, don't go to the Gentiles, but go to the lost sheep. And then in Acts 1, he tells the disciples, go to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the land. So what's going on? Well, very clearly, what's going on is that the lost sheep were being... Sorry about that. I had a phone call. Probably got a little choppy there. But what's happening here is the lost sheep are being called out from these nations. Okay, like Revelation 5 says, he redeemed them and called them out from every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. That's exactly what's happening here. All right, they weren't going out to save pagans. They were going out to save what was lost, to seek and save that which was lost, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus wasn't confused. Jesus didn't change the story. Jesus didn't contradict himself. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was sending disciples to nations and to Samaria and to different places for the purpose of seeking the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So when we see him bring Peter to Cornelius, and Peter gets a vision of what God has cleansed, keyword cleansed, do not call unclean. God is cleansing paganized, dispersed, scattered Israelites who were guilty and dead in trespasses and sins. These were Gentiles by every sense of the word and every sense of the imagination. And to any good Jew, these would be called true Gentiles. They were unclean. They were dirty. Okay, they were the prodigal son that was out in the nations wallowing around in filth. And the final picture is God promising them that nothing unclean would ever enter into the city that only had the 12 tribes' names written on it. Anyways, that's all I got for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like. If not, call me a loser. Hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.